Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Seeing Red podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Fulce. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, apologize for not putting out an episode on Friday. I was sick. I'm still recovering from it, but I tried to record and I couldn't think very well and I sounded even worse. So, I just wanted to recover a little bit and then wait for the state of the state to kind of have a better idea of just what this week's going to look like going forward. So, just thank you so much for joining us. Like and subscribe if you're able to, but I'll just jump right into it. So the governor did his State of the State address yesterday, where he outlined his priorities for the upcoming legislative session and was talking about just the key issues that he wanted the legislature to take up. Now, he also designated several things as emergency items. For the most part, the legislature cannot take up and pass legislation until at least 61 days into session. We're about 3 weeks into it now. But the governor can designate emergency items that they can take up immediately. And he listed a few of them. Let me pull those up. But the governor released several of those. He made property tax relief an emergency item. There are a number of things the governor outlined in that. We'll get into it. He also did water infrastructure as an emergency item. He wants to increase teacher pay as an emergency item, expand career training, school choice, and bail reform. Wants to create a cyber command, Texas Cyber Command, as an emergency item. So these are all things that the governor is prioritizing for the legislature that they can take up immediately. SB 2 was heard last week in committee. SB 2 is the ESA, or Education Savings Account bill that is being pushed through the Senate at the moment. It should take a vote. The final vote should pass the Senate by Wednesday, and then that gets sent over to the House. Now, where that goes in the House, we'll see. But we're waiting on the House. The committee assignments for the House should come out. The scuttlebutt is that it'll come out sometime this week. We're hoping by Friday. Could have come sooner. Could come later. But those are the kind of the big picture items of what's happened this week. And I'm going to kind of explain to those who don't know a little bit about what that means and what this session is likely to look like. So, top of it is the big issue from kind of a campaign side of things is ESAs, school choice. Last year, there was an attempt to combine school funding and teacher raises with a school choice program via an omnibus bill that there was ultimately an amendment to decouple those things that was successful, and that killed both bills, or both elements of the bill. And then that wasn't happened in the fourth special session, and then they had the primary after that. Most of the Republicans that voted to split those two items in that amendment either chose not to run for re-election or were defeated in a primary. And so there's a lot of new folks where it's likely that school choice will be something that can pass. Now, what that looks like, we don't know. I mean, we do know. We have a better idea of what the Senate proposal looks like, and that's almost certainly to pass pretty well here in the next few days. But this time around, they're not linking the two issues together. A lot of things have happened with school funding. A lot of districts are facing budget shortfalls, are having to cut staff and all sorts of programming to be within their budget. And because they haven't had an increase to the allotment in a few years. So the state has not given them more money to cope with the inflation that we've all had to deal with. So we're going to see how that plays out. I don't know how it's going to play out. I imagine there will be a raise. I'm not sure to what degree, but I imagine there will be a raise for teachers that happens fairly quickly and with little um, pushback throughout the process. The school choice bill, uh, the Senate is basically making it where there's going to be $1 billion in the first year. I think it goes up to $3 billion total, and and people who qualify will be able to have an account created in their child's name, where up to $11,500 can be credited to that account to then pay for um, educational services. If you're accepted into the program, you'll get $2,000, and if you use and if you're going to an approved provider, there will be additional, I think, like whatever that difference is, 9,500 that is plugged into your account to help with tuition and those sorts of things. That's a way of saying that if you're in a homeschooler that's approved for the program, you'll get $2,000, and if you're somebody who goes to private school, you get 11,500. So those are two elements of it. Now, what's interesting about the ESAs is that the people who get the money have to be approved by the state. So that is a kind of a string that the Republican Party of Texas and their platform committee did not envision when they passed their plank supporting school choice. So we'll see if that remains in the final language for a school choice bill. Excuse me. Still getting over the sickness. So we'll see if that remains in the bill. But basically, the comptroller's office would be given control to determine whether or not someone's accredited or approved to be part of the program. So a school would have to opt in to being able to receive those funds. That's the way the system is currently laid out. It'll ramp up to a certain size, and then we'll have to expand or increase as future legislators determine. And it's going to pass the Senate. It'll pass the Senate this week. The holdup on the House side is that once it passes the Senate, it goes over to the House and has to be considered by the House. Well, the House doesn't have committees yet. And this is over the past, if you look at it, the past like 7 sessions, committee assignments in the House are typically announced in this week. It's kind of between February 1st and 9th. I think one time it was before that, but it's typically this is the week when those announcements are made. So those committee chairs will organize their committees, and then they'll be able to start. Those bills will start being able to be referred to those committees for them to run their process. I don't know if there's a House version of school choice yet. I haven't heard about it. No one's talking about it, so I don't think there is. But if there will be, it'll be a House version that ends up being debated. Or if the Senate version goes through the House and it gets amended, it has to go back to the Senate. And if the Senate can't, if that bill passes through the House, it goes back to the Senate, and it's amended, it goes back to the Senate, where the Senate votes on those amendments. If the Senate doesn't agree on those amendments, they can vote to go to conference committee, and then the two chambers get together and they work out the bill differences. And then that final bill goes back to the chambers to be voted on before it goes to the governor's desk for signature or veto. As this is the governor's big signature piece, it would be very surprising if he ended up vetoing a school choice bill of any kind, but you never know. But that's how the process is expected to lay out. I don't really expect school choice to be across the finish line very quickly. No one does. If they expected it to take a few months for the House and the Senate to come to an agreement on what it'll look like. And what's interesting is on the left, you have the Democrats who are just generally opposed to it as a whole. So you have a whole block on the left that's opposed to it. And then you have some Republicans who want there to be strings attached, like the ones that are already in it. accountability of what the public dollar is going to. They're hoping to find, there's accountability in the system. But on the other side, you have folks who don't want that accountability in there at all. And it's going to be interesting to see how the the different majorities in the Senate and the House thread that needle long term, or not in this process on this particular issue. Now, we'll talk about school choice, I'm sure, several times. I'm going to try and get some guests to kind of talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts as we get more into the process. But for now, that's kind of where that issue sits. There's some other major issues that the governor designated as emergency items that I think deserve some conversation. One is, he mentioned that in the previous session, the legislature put out $1 billion towards water infrastructure. Texas is a fast-growing state, but it is a state with a lot of rivers, a state with a lot of water. Obviously, we have a coastline. We've built a ton of lakes in this state. If my knowledge is correct on this, there's only one natural lake in the state, and the rest of them we've built. We've built them for flood control and mitigation, and for water, because we need to have water for the people who've moved here. As we could look at population projections over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we have to start building a water infrastructure for that Texas. So the governor has designated this an emergency item because we need to put in a tremendous amount of investment into both our water infrastructure and into our power generation infrastructure. Now, Texas is building more and more thermal, more and more oil and gas, natural gas, electric generation. We'll see how much wind and solar is built with the Trump administration, but the federal incentives for wind and solar have driven that market in Texas. It's not so much been the local incentives, though. The Governor Perry did a podcast last year where he kind of talked about the reason why wind and solar was brought into Texas in the first place. It was pre-fracking. Back in the early 2000s, natural gas was not cheap. There wasn't a lot of it, and energy costs were skyrocketing. So they wanted to lower energy costs. So they added these types of these wind and solar capacity to the grid. And what we've found is, once we had fracking, we had natural gas with an overwhelming abundance, very cheap to produce here in the state. Like, we didn't need wind and solar in the same way that we had, and because of all the federal incentives for wind and solar, it threw off the market incentives for building and maintaining thermal generation. And the problem with that has been that there are times where it's more and more difficult to be profitable with LNG or any other type of thermal producer, and to go in and build more production, because you have this other competitor, wind and solar, where on wind's case, they can be profitable even if they're like selling energy at a negative rate, which is something that can happen in the energy market, and it's kind of insane. But it's impossible for wind not to make money because of all the federal tax incentives. So what Texas is having to do is re-incentivize the market, change the incentive market on that side, and that's something that the legislature is going to have to look at. The governor wants to build at least 10 more megawatts, gigawatts, whatever the unit is, over the next couple years. But frankly, we probably need to build I've seen estimates where we need to build at least 50% more capacity than what we currently have. And 10 would be about 20% more. So that's something where his other thing that he mentioned was a bigger dive into being a leader of nuclear energy, and there are different types of nuclear energy that we should be looking at for small reactor, and also there's other types like molten salt that we need to be looking at as viable options for energy generation in this state, because we have to have a lot more energy and a lot more water. So the governor is looking, I think, at $5 billion increase in investment toward. I might be wrong on that number, but I think it's a $5 billion investment in water infrastructure. This is a rural urban issue because typically you build these water storage facilities, lakes, reservoirs in rural areas because they end up taking up a lot of acre feet of land. Sorry, it's a lot of acres of land, and you don't want to do that in the middle of downtown Dallas. It's a lot more expensive to eminent domain that property, but people still live where the water is. So it's always been a contentious issue of, oh, we don't want. You're seeing it from the folks in East Texas talking about that we don't. This is Dallas's problem. East Texas just wants to be left alone. But we're a state, and this is a problem that's going to have to be worked out between everybody. And it's something where we have to focus on the problem, but it's also a problem that Texas has been dealing with for its entire existence. If you look back at reporting on the Texas legislature from 120 years ago, and any time between then and now, the three issues, at least, that you'll see in every single one is water, immigration, and transportation. You'll see those are the main things. In education, those are four. You're going to see those four things like being the major things people are talking about, and the legislature is trying to move one way or the other. And the dividing line isn't always Republican, Democrat, and it's usually rural versus urban. So those are going to be some interesting fights that we see in the legislature coming up. And depending on where you're listening to this from, this podcast from, you're going to have a different opinion. If you're in a place like Houston where you can't really pull groundwater, they're both the Houston and Fort Bend. All these coastal areas have what are called subsidence districts, which basically are a state district that's been created to manage how much subsidence there is, which is when there's too much groundwater pulled out, the ground sinks and causes all the infrastructure to break. Well, that's a separate problem. So a lot of places, so in Fort Bend County, there are a number of, there's the Brazos River towards its mouth, where it has the most water, goes right through this county. So you'd think we'd be pretty easy just to pull the water from that. But over the years, different places have bought that water already, different utilities over the area. So there are areas of Fort Bend County that can't get water from Fort Bend County. They have to go find it from somewhere else. And these types of projects complicate all of this conversation. And they're complicated issues, and that a lot of times can have direct impact on people hundreds of miles away to make sure that we have the water necessary. So it's something that we have to look at and talk about thoroughly and thoughtfully, and get a lot of input from folks to do it correctly. So water is a big one. What were the other ones that he mentioned? Sorry, I'm going to go back to that. Teacher pay, like I said before, that one's almost certainly going to go through pretty quickly. The one that kind of surprised folks was expanding career training. So people want to be they want people to graduate from high school in Texas, but be either the college ready or career ready. And they want to invest a lot more into kids being, adults being career ready. Sorry about that. I had a coughing fit. Career ready. So plumbing, electric, those sorts of jobs, more what are traditionally considered blue collar jobs, but are just jobs that are highly trained and um, very specialized, but that don't necessarily require that training to be done through a college classroom, but through on the job experience. We want to make sure kids are ready to go into those fields if that's the jobs they want to go into. Something to really prioritize to making sure that if you're not going to college, you're ready for a career. So that's one of the investments the governor declared as an emergency. I know he wants that to be discussed early, often, and to get to his desk. And also, he put out bail reform. Bail reform, if I recall correctly from his speech, basically making it so that's nearly impossible for somebody indicted on capital charges to get bail. And capital charges being charges that are eligible for the death penalty. And then for folks who have previously been convicted of violent crimes, being charged with another violent crime. For those folks to be assumed to be flight risks, which I mean people who would be likely not to show up for court, and be not granted bail. Because there have been any number of folks, and he used an example of a deputy who was killed, that have been subsequently killed by folks who are on bail for murder. That seems like an interesting. It seems like a no-brainer, common sense issue that I agree with. I don't know, even with the Republican, conservative, friendly judiciary that we're presumed to have right now. I don't know how the Sixth Amendment. I think it's the Sixth Amendment, but there are certain amendments. It's fourth, fifth, and sixth. I don't recall which one this one applies to. There are concerns with bail is something that's a constitutional right. In order to limit that right, there has to be a compelling reason. And I don't know if other legislatures have tested this theory or not. So I'm unsure of the constitutionality of it, but I think it's something that may be worth changing. So those are the thoughts on those issues from the governor's state of the state. I don't know. So I'm gonna kind of cut the programming there and gonna talk a little bit about the podcast for a second. I don't know. I'm gonna try and keep recording on Fridays. I don't know if I'm gonna do Fridays or change it to Monday/Sunday release date. It seems to me that having a recap that's released and then ready, like as a recap of the week and a kind of forecast for the upcoming week, all in one episode that releases for folks to listen to on a Sunday or on Monday morning, seems like it'd be a better thing. If you have a thought on if you're in the Capitol or if you're working in it, that if there's a time or a place where you think that this would fit better, reach me, shoot out a message to me. I would love to hear your thoughts on kind of that sort of stuff, or if there are topics that you're working on or that you're passionate about that you think that you'd like me to research or talk about on the show during the session. Or there's a news story that you think I might not have seen, tag me on Twitter or shoot me a DM. My DMs are open. You can email me at hosts@seeingredpodcast.com. Reach out to me. I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about what you're interested in. Otherwise, I'm probably just going to stick to the top, the main things people are talking about on the show. Talking about in the media. But I appreciate you listening. Sorry for kind of the rambly episode. I'm once again getting over the cold, not feeling my best. But I appreciate everyone who listens, and thank you so much. You have a great time, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
You've been listening to the Seeing Red podcast. It's always Texas politics and beyond. We present the facts and opinions. The Seeing Red podcast with your host, Andy Turner and Garrett Fulce. Thank you, and tune in next week. And please do us a favor. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode.